How long would you survive in ancient Egypt? Would you have enough knowledge to last at least a week? We are used to seeing Egypt through the prism of majestic pyramids and golden sarcophagi, forgetting about the everyday reality of the millions of people who built this grandeur. Their lives were a continuous series of challenges, where knowledge, hard work, and strict adherence to rules were the only guarantee of survival. Forget everything you knew about ancient Egypt from movies and popular books. The reality was much more prosaic and at the same time more complicated than you can imagine. Watch the video to the end and you will learn what simple knowledge distinguished the survivors from the doomed in a world where one wrong step could cost everything. Survival in ancient Egypt did not begin with the search for food or shelter, but with an understanding of the main principle that governed the entire universe, Ma'at. It was not just a word, but a fundamental concept of order, truth, justice, and harmony. Violating Ma'at meant plunging into chaos, which for an Egyptian was tantamount to death. Every day from dawn to dusk was subject to following this principle. This applied not only to obeying the law, but also to everyday matters, honesty in calculations, conscientious performance of work, and respectful treatment of elders. The Egyptians believed that every action that disturbed harmony distanced them from the favor of the gods in society. Your social survival depended directly on the reputation of a person living according to the laws of Ma'at. Neighbors, the village headman, the local priest, everyone watched your behavior. If you slipped up once, you risked losing trust, and with it, the help that was critical in difficult times. At the heart of Ma'at was the idea of cyclicality and predictability, similar to the flooding of the Nile. The Egyptians sought to make their lives as orderly as the movement of the heavenly bodies. Any deviation from the established order was perceived as a threat to the stability of the entire community. This principle also applied to professional activities. A craftsman who produced poor quality goods, or a farmer who hid part of his harvest, was considered a violator of Ma'at. Their actions undermined the economic foundation of society and could lead to famine or a shortage of resources. Even in family relationships, the principle of harmony prevailed. Disputes and conflicts were resolved peacefully through the mediation of elders. It was believed that discord in the family brought chaos to the orderly world and could bring the wrath of the gods upon the entire household. It is interesting to consider how this concept is perceived today. Do you agree that adherence to unwritten rules of order and justice is more important than personal gain for the survival of society? Please share your thoughts on this matter. Every opinion is valuable. Your first step toward physical survival would be to build a home. Forget about stone and marble. Those are materials for temples and tombs. Your house would be built from the most accessible materials provided by the Nile, silt and clay. The walls were built from unfired mud bricks, which were made from a mixture of Nile silt, sand, and chopped straw. This mixture was thoroughly kneaded with the feet, then placed in wooden molds and left to dry in the scorching sun. The process was laborious and required the participation of the entire family. These bricks had excellent thermal insulation properties. During the day under the scorching sun, the thick clay walls kept the interior cool. At night, they slowly released the heat accumulated during the day, preventing the dwelling from cooling down too much. The roof of your house would be flat and made of palm logs, on which reed mats and a layer of clay were laid. Such a roof not only protected from the sun, but also served as additional living space. Here, grain was dried, supplies were stored, and on particularly sultry nights, people slept. The windows were small and located high under the ceiling. This was done to allow as little direct sunlight and hot air into the house as possible. Doorways were often covered with wet mats, which evaporated moisture and further cooled the room. The floor in the house was earthen, carefully tamped down and sometimes covered with a layer of clay. To keep the floor clean and dust-free, it was covered with mats made of reeds or palm leaves. These mats were easily replaced as they wore out. The interior decoration was extremely simple. The furniture consisted of low clay benches along the walls, a small wooden chest for storing valuables, and several woven baskets. The Egyptians slept on mats and used special wooden or stone headrests as pillows. But what governed life within these walls? In the next chapter, we will explore how the Egyptians organized their time and why their calendar was key to the survival of their entire civilization. Your survival in ancient Egypt depended not on strength or agility, but on the ability to live in strict rhythm, set by nature and the stars. The Egyptians created one of the first accurate calendars in history, and it was not just a way of counting days, but a real tool for survival. The entire life of the country, from the pharaoh to the last peasant, was subject to this calendar. The year was divided into 3 seasons, each lasting 4 months. The names of the seasons spoke for themselves and determined the occupation of every inhabitant of the Nile Valley. Your harvest, and therefore your life, depended on how closely you followed this schedule. The first season was called Akhet, the time of flooding. When the Nile overflowed its banks, flooding the fields, all agricultural work ceased. This was the time for construction, repairing tools, and performing public duties, such as participating in the construction of temples. The second season, Pere, began after the water receded, leaving fertile silt in the fields. This was the time to go out into the fields, the time for sowing. Missing the right moment meant losing the entire future harvest, so the signals of nature and the instructions of the priests were followed with particular attention. The third season, Shemu, was a time of drought and harvest. It was the most intense period of the year, when the whole family worked in the fields from dawn to dusk. The harvested grain had to be not only threshed, but also safely stored until the next harvest, protected from pests and moisture. The calendar was based on observations of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. Priest astronomers accurately calculated that its first rise after a period of invisibility coincided with the beginning of the Nile flood. This day marked the beginning of the new year, starting another cycle of life. For you as a survivor, this calendar would be the law of life. It determined when to sow, when to reap, when to pay taxes, and when to participate in religious festivals. It was simply impossible to live outside this rhythm. It would mean falling out of the system and condemning yourself to starvation. Daily life in ancient Egypt was synonymous with the word labor. About 90% of the population were peasants, and their survival depended entirely on working the land. This work was cyclical, hard, and almost never stopped. The main agricultural crops were emmer, a type of wheat, and barley. Emmer was used to bake bread, which was the staple of the diet, and barley was used to make beer, the second most important food product. The yield of these crops depended directly on the quality of the Nile flood and the timely cultivation of the fields. After the Nile receded, when the ground was still soft and moist, plowing began. Oxen harnessed to a primitive wooden plow were used as draft animals. This plow only loosened the top layer of fertile silt, preparing it for sowing. Sowing was done by hand. The farmer walked across the field with a basket of grain and scattered it evenly over the plowed land. To ensure that the seeds went deeper into the soil and were not pecked by birds, flocks of sheep or goats were driven across the field to trample the grain into the ground. Irrigation was a key factor in success. Although the Nile brought moisture, it was not enough during the dry season. The Egyptians created a complex system of canals and dams to retain water and distribute it across the fields. To lift water to higher areas, they used a shadoof, a simple but effective device similar to a well crane. Harvesting was the most important part of the process. Men cut the ears of grain with wooden sickles with flint inserts. Women and teenagers followed behind, gathering the cut ears into sheaves and carrying them to the threshing floor, a compacted area for threshing. Threshing was done with the help of animals. The sheaves were laid out on the threshing floor, and oxen or donkeys were driven over them. With their hooves, they knocked the grains out of the ears, separating them from the straw. This was followed by the winnowing process. The grain, together with the chaff, was thrown into the air with wooden shovels. The wind carried the light chaff away, and the heavy grains fell back to the ground. It was painstaking work that required patience and skill. The harvested crop did not belong entirely to the farmer. A significant portion of it was taken as tax to the pharaoh's treasury, temples, and the local noblemen on whose land he worked. The remaining grain had to be enough to feed the family until the next harvest. How much do you think this taxation system affected the motivation of the ordinary laborer? In the next chapter, we will learn how the Egyptians dressed and what efforts they made to maintain cleanliness in a hot climate. In the Egyptian climate, clothing served not so much to keep warm as to protect the body. The main requirements for clothing were lightness, simplicity, and the ability to protect the skin from the scorching sun. The main and practically only material used for making clothing was linen. Linen fabric was the ideal choice for a hot climate. It was breathable, allowing the body to breathe, and dried quickly. The quality of linen varied from coarse cloth for workers to the finest, almost transparent viscose worn by the nobility. Men's clothing was extremely simple and consisted of a loincloth called a skenty. The length and drape of the skenty could indicate the social status of the wearer. Peasants and artisans wore short, simple loincloths that did not restrict movement. Women's clothing consisted of a straight dress with one or two straps, known as a kalaziris. It fit snugly around the figure and reached the ankles. For ease of movement during work, women could wear shorter versions of the dress. Both men and women walked barefoot most of the time. Sandals made of papyrus or leather were a sign of wealth and were worn mainly on special occasions. Ordinary people could only afford rough woven sandals to protect their feet while working in the fields. Despite the simplicity of their clothing, the Egyptians paid great attention to personal hygiene and appearance. Cleanliness of the body was considered not only an aesthetic norm, but also a religious requirement. It was believed that cleanliness brought a person closer to the gods. The Egyptians washed daily, usually in the Nile or in special canals. They used natron, a natural alkali, mixed with animal fat or vegetable oils as a detergent. This mixture effectively cleansed the skin of dirt and sweat. Hair care was considered particularly important. Many Egyptians, both men and women, cut their hair short or shaved their heads altogether to avoid problems in the hot climate. Instead of their own hair, the nobility wore wigs made of human hair or plant fibers, which protected their heads from the sun. Both men and women lined their eyes with black paint, coal, and green paint from crushed malachite. This was done not only for beauty, it was believed that the paint protected the eyes from the bright sun and dust and repelled insects. The look was completed with various oils and incense, which were used to anoint the body. Vegetable oils, scented with flowers and herbs, protected the skin from drying out in the sun and gave it a pleasant aroma. This was an essential part of daily personal care. The diet in ancient Egypt was simple, but balanced enough to sustain the strength needed for hard physical labor. The basis of the diet, for both the poor and the pharaoh, consisted of two products made from grain, bread and beer. They were called bread and beer, and this expression meant sustenance in general. Bread was baked from coarsely ground flour made from emmer wheat. The grain was ground by hand on stone grinders, which was hard work that took women several hours every day. Because of this method of grinding, stone chips got into the flour, which over time led to severe tooth wear among the entire population. The dough was kneaded with water, salt, and sometimes leaven. The bread was made in various shapes, round, oval, triangular, and in the form of human figures. It was baked either in hot ashes or in special conical clay ovens. Beer was not just a drink, but an important part of the diet, rich in calories and nutrients. It was made from barley, but the technology differed from modern methods. The Egyptians baked special beer breads, which were then crumbled, poured with water, and left to ferment. The resulting drink was thick, cloudy, and more like liquid porridge. It was low in alcohol, but very nutritious. Everyone, from young to old, drank beer, and it often served not only as a drink, but also as food, quenching both thirst and hunger. The diet was supplemented with vegetables grown in small gardens. The most common were onions, garlic, lettuce, cucumbers, and various types of legumes. Onions and garlic were valued not only for their taste, but also for their antiseptic properties. Fish from the Nile and wild birds caught in papyrus thickets served as a source of protein. Meat from domestic animals was only available on major holidays or for very wealthy people. The most popular fruits were dates, figs, and grapes. Dates were eaten fresh and dried and were also used to make a sweet syrup that replaced sugar. How difficult do you think it would be for a modern person to adapt to such a diet? In the next chapter, we will look at how Egyptian society was structured and what place you would have in it. Ancient Egyptian society was strictly hierarchical and resembled a pyramid. At the top was the pharaoh, who was considered a living god. At the base was a huge mass of ordinary people whose labor created the greatness of Egypt. Your survival and quality of life depended directly on which level of the pyramid you were on. Social mobility was extremely low. A peasant's son had a 99% chance of becoming a peasant himself, and a craftsman's son inherited his father's profession. Immediately below the pharaoh were the highest officials: the vizier, chati, high priests, and military commanders. They were the elite of society, possessing enormous power and wealth. They ruled the country on behalf of the pharaoh, administered justice, and controlled the collection of taxes. Below them were local officials, scribes, engineers, and architects. Scribes were the educated class of society and were held in high esteem. The ability to read, write, and count opened the way to public service and was one of the few ways to climb the social ladder. The next level was occupied by craftsmen: stonecutters, carpenters, potters, and jewelers. Their work was important to the country's economy, and skilled craftsmen could live in relative prosperity. However, they were completely dependent on orders from temples or nobles and were not free to choose their occupation. Next came the soldiers. In times of peace, the army was small and professional. During major military campaigns, recruits were drafted from among the peasants. Military service was hard, but it offered the chance to receive trophies and land after retirement. The vast majority of the population, peasants, were at the bottom of the social ladder. They did not own the land they worked on, but only rented it from the pharaoh, temples, or nobility. Their lives were completely subject to the agricultural cycle and the will of the landowner. Formally, there was no classical slavery in Egypt as it existed in Rome or Greece. However, the position of peasants was close to serfdom. They were tied to the land and could not leave it without permission. Thus, if you found yourself in ancient Egypt, you would most likely have joined the ranks of the peasants. Your life would have been full of hard labor, deprivation, and complete submission to those above you in the social hierarchy. The only way to survive in such a system was to accept your place and follow the rules without question. The justice system in ancient Egypt was inseparable from the concept of ma'at. Any crime was considered not simply as an offense against a person, but as a violation of the universal order. The purpose of the court was not so much to punish the guilty as to restore the disturbed harmony. Formally, the pharaoh was the supreme judge. However, in practice, judicial functions were performed by his deputies, primarily the vizier. In cities and villages, there were local courts called kenbet, which included respected members of the community, priests, scribes, and elders. There was no written code of laws in Egypt similar to the Code of Hammurabi. Judges made decisions based on precedents, traditions, and their own understanding of justice. This made the judicial system flexible, but at the same time opened up opportunities for arbitrariness. The trial was oral. The plaintiff and defendant presented their arguments before the judges and called witnesses. All testimony was given under oath in the name of the pharaoh and the gods. Perjury was considered a serious crime that violated ma'at. The most common cases were related to property disputes: theft, non-payment of debts, and disputes over land boundaries. Theft of grain from a barn or agricultural tools was considered a serious offense that undermined the foundations of the economy. Punishments were severe and often included corporal punishment. For petty theft, a few dozen to 100 lashes with a stick could be imposed. It was a public and humiliating punishment that served as a lesson to others. More serious crimes, such as robbery, banditry, or intentional murder, were punishable by death. The methods of execution varied: drowning in the Nile, burning, or impalement. Such harsh measures were intended to maintain order and instill fear in potential criminals. Tomb robbery was considered a particularly serious crime. Since the tomb was the home for eternal life, its desecration was equated with the murder of the soul of the deceased. Tomb robbers faced a painful execution without the right to a dignified burial. Corruption among officials and judges was also severely punished. Bribery and abuse of power were considered a direct insult to Ma'at. An official caught doing this could be stripped of their position, property, and even their life. For you, as a survivor, knowledge of local laws and customs would be vital. Any conflict with a neighbor or representative of the authorities could land you in court, where a simple person without connections or money had little chance of a fair decision. The best strategy was to avoid any disputes and strictly follow the established rules. Religion permeated absolutely every aspect of ancient Egyptian life. The gods were not somewhere far away in the heavens. They were everywhere, in the flooding of the Nile, in the sunlight, in the breath of the wind, in every animal and plant. Survival in Egypt was unthinkable without constant dialogue with this world of supernatural forces. The pantheon of Egyptian gods was huge and included hundreds of deities. Every city and village had its own patrons. The main gods revered throughout the country were Ra, the sun god, Osiris, the lord of the underworld, his wife Isis, and their son Horus. Daily life was filled with rituals designed to appease the gods and ensure their protection. Every morning began with prayer and a small offering to the household deities. Before starting any important work, whether it was sewing or building a house, the Egyptians asked for the blessing of the appropriate gods. Amulets played a huge role in life. They were worn by everyone, from the pharaoh to the lowliest peasant. Amulets in the form of a scarab, the eye of Horus, Ujat, or the sign of life, Ankh, were supposed to protect against evil spirits, disease, and misfortune. They were made of stone, faience, or metal and worn around the neck or wrist. Priests were intermediaries between the world of humans and the world of gods. They performed complex temple rituals, kept track of the calendar, and interpreted the will of the gods. The position of priest was very honorable and was passed down through inheritance, providing a stable and high income. Ordinary people did not have access to the sanctuaries of temples. They could only participate in public religious festivals, which were held several times a year. During these festivals, statues of the gods were taken out of the temples and carried through the streets of the cities, and people addressed them with prayers and requests. The Egyptians also believed in the existence of evil spirits and hostile forces. To protect their homes, they painted magical symbols on the walls and placed figurines of protective gods, such as the fierce dwarf god Bes, at the entrance. He was believed to scare away evil spirits and nightmares. Dreams were perceived as messages from the gods or omens of future events. There were special dream books that helped interpret dreams. Important and disturbing dreams were discussed with priests to understand their meaning and take the necessary action. Magic was inseparable from religion. The Egyptians believed that with the help of the right spells and rituals, it was possible to influence events, cure diseases, or harm enemies. There were professional magicians who were consulted for help in difficult life situations. For you as a stranger, this world would be full of dangers. Accidental disrespect for a local deity or violation of a taboo could be taken as a terrible insult. To survive, you would have to respect the beliefs of the Egyptians and participate in common rituals, even without understanding their deeper meaning. For the ancient Egyptians, earthly life was only a brief preparation for the main event, eternal life. Belief in the afterlife was central to their worldview and determined many of their actions. All of a person's efforts and savings throughout their life were directed toward ensuring a dignified existence after death. The Egyptians believed that a person consisted of several entities, including the physical body, Shiti, the soul, Ba, the life force, Ka, and the shadow, Shut. To achieve eternal life, it was necessary to preserve all these elements after death. That is why so much importance was attached to the preservation of the body. Mummification was a complex and expensive process that was not accessible to everyone. The body of the deceased was treated with special compounds, The internal organs were removed and placed in canopic jars. The body was then dried with natron and tightly wrapped in linen bandages, between which amulets were placed. For ordinary people who could not afford full mummification, there were simpler methods. Their bodies were simply dried in the hot desert sand. The dry climate contributed to natural preservation, which also allowed the body to be preserved for the afterlife. The tomb was considered the eternal home of the deceased. Pharaohs and nobles built majestic pyramids and rock tombs for themselves. Ordinary Egyptians were content with modest pits in the sand or small mud brick superstructures. The tomb was filled with everything a person might need in the afterlife. These included furniture, clothing, dishes, food, and drinks. It was believed that the Ka of the deceased would use these items in the afterlife. Scenes from earthly life were depicted on the walls of the tombs, and magical texts and spells from the Book of the Dead were written there. These texts were supposed to help the deceased overcome all dangers on the way to the afterlife and successfully pass the judgment of Osiris. The judgment of Osiris was a key moment in the afterlife journey. The heart of the deceased was weighed on the scales of the goddess Maat. A feather symbolizing truth was placed on the other side of the scales. If the heart was lighter than the feather, it meant that the person had led a righteous life and was admitted to the fields of Yalu, the Egyptian paradise. If the heart was weighed down by sins, it was devoured by the monster Ammut. This meant the final and irrevocable destruction of the soul. Fear of this judgment compelled the Egyptians to strive to live in accordance with the principles of Ma'at throughout their earthly lives. Survival in ancient Egypt meant not only worrying about your daily bread, but also constantly thinking about preparing for eternity. You would have to set aside part of your meager income to buy amulets, pay for the services of priests, and prepare your own modest tomb. After all, in the Egyptian worldview, earthly difficulties were temporary, while eternity was infinite. We conclude our immersion into the everyday reality of ancient Egypt. As you have seen, survival in this great civilization required not so much heroic effort as methodical work, patience, and a deep understanding of the surrounding world. From the laws of harmony of Ma'at to the strict agricultural calendar, every aspect of life was subject to clear and inviolable rules. The life of an ordinary Egyptian was far from the romantic image created by popular culture. It was a life full of physical exertion, social restrictions, and constant dependence on the will of nature and the gods. However, it was this strict system that allowed Egyptian civilization to survive for millennia, leaving behind a legacy that still amazes us today. What aspect of survival in ancient Egypt did you find most difficult or unexpected? Could you adapt to a life where your every step was predetermined by the flooding of the river and the movement of the stars? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journeys into the past.